exactly are polyrhythms? Well, polyrhythms are often misinterpreted as two or more sequences with a different number of steps, but running at the same tempo. These two sequences have different lengths, so they finish at different times and jump back to their first step. And due to the different number of steps, these sequences desynchronize themselves, and at some point they meet again and start over in their first step together. The Division 6 sequencer makes this clearly visible here. I just added an accent when this happens to make it audible. The synchronization always happens after the step count reaches the lowest common multiple of the length of both sequences. So here for a 3 and 4 step sequence it's 12. Step number 13 is therefore the one where both sequences jump to their first step again at the same time. And then they run synchronized again, but only until the shorter sequence reaches its last step and jumps back to its first step, before the longer sequence reaches its last step. And after another 12 steps, these two sequences are synchronized again. Well, these uneven sequences can yield nice and long melodies, however they are not polyrhythmic. We would call them polymetric instead. A real polyrhythm is achieved by two or more sequences which have a different number of steps like we had before, but they run at different speeds so that they always finish at the same time. For my sequences here with 3 and 4 steps, this means that the 3-step sequence runs slower and reaches its last step at the same time as the 4-step sequence. So how to set this up? When you have a clock divider, it's particularly easy. Just select the desired division, while 2x3, 3x4 and 4x5 are quite common ones, which are not too arrhythmic. This happens for larger divisions. We now feed the original clock and the output of the clock divider into the sequencer, and you could also use envelopes if you don't want to create melodies or sample and holds, something like that. However, with sequencers it's pretty straightforward because you can create polyrhythmic melodies. Let's choose the 2x3 for now, so the original clock makes 3 triggers and the clock divider output only 2 in the same time. Now we have to set the sequence length to match the clock divisions. For the 2x3 polyrhythm, one sequence is 3 steps long and the other one is 2 steps long. The slower sequence always has less steps, and when you use a clock divider, the sequence which is driven by the clock divider output is the one which has less steps. In the Division 6 sequencer you can set loop points, and the upper sequencer now has a loop point after step 3 and the lower sequencer has its loop point already after step 2. And by the way, you could also multiply the division by an integer number and make the sequences longer. So for my division here of 2x3, you could multiply it by 2 and have a 4 and 6 step sequence, or you could multiply it by 3 and you get a 6 and 9 step sequence. But let's just leave it at 3 and 2 steps. And now we are ready to go, and this is how it sounds. And actually I messed this up a bit here because I forgot to synchronize these two sequences at their first steps, so they actually meet at step 3 for the upper and step 1 for the lower sequence. You can spot that these steps become active at the same time. And when you concentrate on the two sequences, you hear that one does 2 and the other does 3 steps in the same time. So it's a real polyrhythm. Let's also try a division by 3 and 4. So we have to adjust the sequence length. Accordingly, the first has 4 steps and the second one has 3 steps. And here we go. This is already more complex in the resulting rhythm, and I also have a better version here where the sequences are aligned at their first steps. Here we go. This really always gets me. The 3x4 polyrhythm is very nice. From 4x5 and higher, the resulting rhythms appear to be out of sync because your ear starts to lose track. Here's a 4x5 polyrhythm. Already a bit more outside of the comfort zone for my East Coast ear. So, what if you don't have a clock divider, which you definitely should have? Well, assuming you have a sequencer similar to the SQ1 from Korg, so with 2 8-step sequences running at the same speed, and with switchable gates per step, you can create a 2x3 step polyrhythm. Again, one sequence has 2 active gates and the other one has 3 active gates now, and the total number of steps required per sequence is equal for both sequences, as they should terminate at the same time. And it's again the lowest common multiple of the 2 polyrhythmic sequences, so for the 2 and 3 variant it's 6. Set the sequence length to 6 and activate 2 steps in one and 3 steps in the other sequence. And the steps are evenly distributed, so steps 1 and 4 in the 2-step sequence and steps 1, 3 and 5 in the 3-step sequence. The gate outputs of the 2 sequences are simply connected to 2 envelopes here, modulating 2 filters, and the CV outputs of both sequences go to the 2 VCOs here, all from the System 100 from Behringer. For longer polyrhythmic sequences, you need more steps than most sequencers provide. The lowest common multiple for the 3 and 4 step polyrhythm is 12, and for the 4x5 step polyrhythm it's already 20. So with 2 16-step sequencers we could create a 3x4 step polyrhythm, which we see here. The SQ1 has 4 steps, the dark time has the 3 steps here, and both run through 12 steps. For a 4x5 polyrhythm we need already 20 steps, which is more than many hardware sequencers offer. I chose the key step here and the 3 tracks of the 1027 from Behringer chained together through the 1050. Programming the key step for 5 steps, and the 1027 only switches an envelope gate on and off with 4 steps turned to a high CV in this 20-step sequence. Become a small impro, and I also added an additional modulation and a third oscillator to make it even more interesting. So for even longer polyrhythms you usually need a software sequencer, or at least a programmable one like the keystep or the nerdsec here. The nerdsec has individual clock dividers for each track and also allows microtuning by using the groove parameter, which divides the main clock into 24 parts. So plenty of options for crazy polyrhythms. So that's the brief overview over polyrhythms. To summarize it, you have at least 2 sequences with a different number of steps, and they run at different speeds so that they always terminate at the same time. Different to a polymetric setup where you have again 2 sequences with a different number of steps, but they run at the same speed. So they desynchronize themselves, while a real polyrhythm is always in sync and the 2 or more sequences always begin at the same time. So I hope I was able to shed some light onto this topic. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.